The Foreign Contribution Regulation Act has always been a point of discussion and intrigue right from its origin during the emergency. On 20th September, the FCRA Bill was introduced in Lok Sabha that broadly redefined terms related to acceptance, transfer and utilization of foreign contributions under the 2010 Act. Within less than 10 days, the bill was passed. The FCRA amendments have evinced strong reactions among non-profits and can potentially impact their on-ground work on a massive scale.
Transforming Nonprofits with Sattva Consulting.
Welcome to Transforming Nonprofits. I'm your host Ratish Balakrishnan, and we have with us Samheeta Rao from Gamechangers Law Advisor to decode the FCRA amendments and find out what awaits the future of philanthropy and development in our country. Samheeta Rao is a partner at GLA's Bangalore office and has 14 years of post-qualification experience. Prior to joining GLA, Samheeta co-headed the legal department of Goldman Sachs Bengaluru office and was Goldman's sole employment counsel covering all their India offices during her stint there. Apart from spearheading GLA's employment practice, she spent the last year or so adding strength to GLA's social enterprises practice. Since joining GLA, she has worked with several leading Indian social enterprises and helped them navigate the complex legal and regulatory environment. Pleasure to have you as part of our podcast series for nonprofit organizations. Thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you, Ratish. Happy to be here.
I think one of the biggest changes that has happened, this year for the nonprofit ecosystem overall has been the recent amendments to the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act. And there have been many discussions on the legitimacy of the amendments from the nonprofit ecosystem point of view, etc. But the reality really is that it has practical ramifications for nonprofit organizations and nonprofit leaders on how they structure their programs, their budgets. We wanted to bring you in and get your expert legal perspective, Samheeta, today as part of our conversation on what is the real change that has happened, what is the implication of this change to nonprofit organizations, and what are some recommendations we have or things that they should keep in mind going forward, given that these amendments are now a reality. So to start with, it'll be great to start from what the FCRA Act is about, Samheeta. Then maybe you could segue to what have been some of the recent changes that have been done as part of the 2020 amendment.
Thanks, Ratish. FCRA, it's a very famous acronym now and a very popular or unpopular one, depending on your viewpoint. So the FCRA basically stands for the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act. This is a piece of legislation that was originally introduced in 1976 and since then has undergone several amendments, and the latest act is actually replaced the 1976 Act. So in 2010, the earlier legislation was replaced with what is currently applicable today. In a nutshell, what does the FCRA Act do? It regulates the foreign funding to domestic non-profit organizations. And I'll use the term NPOs here to cover, societies, trusts, not-for-profit companies that have been set up in India. So the thought process behind this legislation is that there cannot be unregulated flow of funds from overseas into these entities. The reason being that the government wants visibility on why this foreign funding is coming, because there is a perception that it could be used for anti-national activities or activities which are not in the public interest. So the FCRA essentially puts in place a regime of registration. So entities that wish to receive funds from overseas should be registered with the FCRA with the government in some form. And there is also a large amount of disclosures that need to be made in terms of how much money you've received, who have you received it from, what have you received it for, and how are you planning to utilize it. This has obviously got a lot of headlines and a lot of attention over the years, not least because there is unfortunately a perception that NPOs are not well governed. 2 years ago, there was a host of government measures leading to cancellation and suspension of licenses of NPOs because of violations of the FCRA. Keeping all of this in mind, I think the governance piece and transparency is what led to the most recent amendments last month. So with effect from September 29th this year, the amendments to the FCRA have come into force. If I were to categorize it into two buckets, structural and procedural, and I'll just walk through top 5 of these changes. 3 of these I would call as structural changes, which strike at the very heart of the way NPOs are functioning. And the other 2 I would term as procedural, on paper which look procedural, but actually significantly impact the functioning of NGOs. The first amendment that has come about in 2020 is the blanket ban on subgrants. This is very significant because earlier there was a permission for NGOs to subgrant their funds to other entities that were either registered with the FCRA or had received permission to subgrant. Now that flexibility of subgranting is completely gone. There are no circumstances under which an entity can subgrant the funds that it has received from overseas. Second, there is a reduction in the amount of foreign contribution that can be used towards administrative expenses. Earlier, the limit was 50% of foreign funds can be allocated towards administrative expenses. This has now been reduced to 20%. Thirdly, there is an expansion of the list of prohibited individuals who can receive foreign contribution. As a lot of listeners may be already aware that there is a list of individuals who cannot in any circumstance receive foreign contribution. These include judges, politicians, candidates for elections, etc. The new addition now is public servants. And one must remember that the term public servant is wider than the term government employee. So a public servant covers even employees of a public sector undertaking. So, for instance, employees of State Bank of India are now covered. It means that with this expansion of the list of prohibited individuals, NGOs will have to review their governing bodies to ensure that they do not have any public servants on their board, to make sure that they can continue to receive foreign contribution. These were the three structural amendments. I'll move on to the other two amendments, which appear procedural. The first is there is now a requirement that all registered NPOs under the FCRA have to open a bank account only with the State Bank of India branch in New Delhi. The government has now notified which branch of State Bank of India in New Delhi this will be. And they have been given time until March 31st to open these accounts. This means that every NGO which has had accounts in other public banks or anywhere else in the country will now have to queue up and open the bank account in the SBI branch in New Delhi. And the second procedural change that has been brought in is that the government has now said that when NGOs come to apply for a renewal of their registration, that will be another opportunity for a scrutiny. So a renewal is no longer a matter of just putting in your papers 6 months in advance of the expiry of your registration, and you can assume that based on your track record, your disclosures and clients. To quickly summarize the 5 key amendments that I just went through. First is the blanket ban on subgrants. Second, reduction of administrative expenses. Third is expansion of the list of prohibited individuals to include public servants. Fourth, opening of a bank account in only one branch of the State Bank of India in New Delhi. And the fifth is renewal of registration is now a new opportunity for scrutiny by the government.
No, thank you, Samheeta. I think this is super comprehensive and very helpful. And I want to take up some of those key points and go into the next level of detail. The first one that I wanted to pick up really was this 20% cap in administrative costs. The administrative cost has been a constant bone in the nonprofit with all types of funders in general. But this limitation of 20% on all FCRA funding received is a huge, has been discussed and contested upon multiple times. Can you give us a little bit more detail on what comes under this 20% cost overall?
So the administrative expenses have been enumerated in the foreign contribution regulation rules that were framed by the government in 2011. I mean, this is obviously defined very broadly and includes anything that you would, in a layman term, construe as administrative expenses. So it definitely includes salaries, wages, and any kind of remuneration paid to your governing body members. It also includes payment of salaries to the people that you hire to manage the projects or manage or run the entity itself, including, reimbursement of expenses, travel costs, or kind of per diem that you might be paying. It also includes things like rent, your utility expenses like electricity, water, telephone, etc. It also includes things like legal and professional charges. So what you pay to your lawyers, what you pay to your accountants, all of that is also covered under administrative expenses. I think there are just one thing that here I would like to highlight. There is an exception to what constitutes administrative expenses for the purposes of FCRA. And this is where salaries or remuneration is paid by an entity that is primarily engaged in research or training. So for entities such as these, which qualify as an association primarily engaged in research or training, their salaries will not be considered within the cap of 20%.
Yeah, and on the last point, I wanted to clarify this because this has come up in a couple of other conversations we've had as well, Samheeta, that NGOs have come back and said, given there is such a exemption, can their training costs or the people costs involved in training be considered as part of this, considered outside of the 20% ambit?
Yeah, I think that's a common question that we have also been receiving. See, the thing is there are two levels of determination that you need to make here. First is, what is the primary purpose of that NGO? So it should be primarily engaged in research or training. So the research or training should not be incidental to what its main objects are. For instance, an NGO that's working with, alleviating poverty or improving sanitation, health and sanitation for females in the rural areas. There will be some amount of training that that entity will do to kind of either on the technology front or on other kind of measures that they're implementing. That would not qualify as a association that is primarily engaged in research or training. You have to be set up for the purpose of research or for the purpose of training. And the second level is you would also do well to look at what is the FCRA categorization at the time of registration. So as many of you may be aware, an entity that receives FCRA registration will be categorized as either cultural, social, educational, or religious programs. So definitely an entity that is looking to take a benefit of this exemption under administrative expenses, I would think that you would have to be registered as an entity in the educational space. That would be something that's telling and would help defend a question as to why the entire foreign contribution can be used towards administrative expense.
Got it. And I wanted to come back to the first point that you made about subgranting. Of course, it has significant impact, especially given in the current environment. A lot of the organizations are looking at setting up collaboratives that involve multiple organizations coming together, and hence there is in some sense inevitably a sense of subgranting that happens. There has also been a question around subcontracting, either subcontracting with a non-profit player, so where you transfer it from providing it as a grant, but to provide it as a contract. And the second is also to subcontract private companies as part of the FCRA funding that you receive. Would be great to hear your thoughts on that as well.
I'll take your first question first, which is, subcontracting versus subgranting. Definitely here, I would pause and carefully review what is the nature of the arrangement here. Because I think there is likelihood and definitely, there will be a lot of attempts made to try to find ways to see how this money can be disbursed onward because of this blanket ban. But I think in essence, you need to see what is this arrangement. A grant essentially means that it is a one-way donation or a one-way flow of money from the donor to the grantor. There is no expectation of return of any kind that the donor expects in this relationship. So, donor X pays the NGO Y a certain sum of money, and the stated goal is whatever is the donor's intent. And NGO then has to go and implement that intent. However, in a service arrangement, which is a subcontracting, there is some amount of services that the donor will receive in return for the service fee that is paid. So, for instance, it might be in terms of advice or, if there is some subject matter expertise, sharing of a particular research or a paper, or even, the kinds like technology that has been developed, so things like that. So there has to be some tangible service or product that is given in return for the service fee or the consideration that has been received by the NGO. So keeping this in mind is very, very important while structuring something as a subcontract, because the grant should not be disguised as a service fee and therefore be given onward to avoid the prohibition on subgranting. So this is very, very important. The second question that you asked is more around whether a for-profit entity can be contracted by an NGO which has received foreign funds. Definitely you can do it, but again, keep in mind that the for-profit entity should be recognized for what service it is providing. Like I said here, it can be, a marketing service or advertising, promotional, technology. These are kind of recognized professional entities, professional services where a for-profit entity can certainly be contracted and must be clearly recorded in the books of accounts and all the books that the NGO maintains that this was the reason that this was paid. It is in no way a subgrant.
Super helpful. The last point I wanted to ask about the changes that have come in, and then I have some subsequent questions, Samheeta, is around the bank account. That has the administrative overheads of setting up a bank account in Delhi. I think one has its long-term ramification that the NGOs are considering, but on an immediate term as well, there is a lack of clarity on what do they do with the current account that they already have, and can they transact money, etc. I know there has been some recent changes around this as well, but it'll be great if you can share some updates on that.
Sure. So I think the ministry, has recognized the procedural difficulties that that will be faced both by the New Delhi branch of SBI as well as NGOs. So firstly, there is a grace period of up till March 31st, 2021 for NGOs to now open their bank account. In the interim, they can continue using their current account that is an FCRA account with any other bank or any other branch of SBI. But come April 1st, 2021, everyone should be using the designated account at the State Bank of India New Delhi branch. That is the first thing. The second thing is the ministry is also expected to issue some protocols regarding the opening of this account. That is still awaited, but presumably, I think keeping in mind, core banking and, the extent of internet and online banking that has now at such an advanced stage, there is a hope that, entities can sit and open this account from anywhere in India and do not have to be physically present at New Delhi to do so. I think there will also presumably be some mention about KYC procedures and related other procedural formalities of bank account opening.
Got it. So with all this focus and limitation on foreign funding, I think there is increased spotlight on the domestic fundraising opportunities and that nonprofits have. And I know from our conversations with nonprofits as well that there is, they're renewing or reinforcing their CSR fundraising strategies overall. At the same time, from our conversations with multinational companies, Samheeta, we also see that multinational companies are looking to comply with the FCRA amendments and the changes therein. Is that something you're seeing as well? And it'd be great to hear your thoughts on that.
See, the first thing is, the changes that have come about are drastic in some sense, but they do not strike at the root of the way in which foreign contributions were regulated. So even before the amendments, the registration was required. That continues. Even before the amendment, service fees that were received by entities providing services in the normal course of business was also exempt. That has not changed. So a lot of the essence of the FCRA continues as before. What I think has changed now is because of this whole blanket ban on subgranting. And that means that, collectives, pooling of funds for a larger project are impossible. Entities are now looking inward to see, are they actually a foreign source? So a classic example is, wholly owned subsidiaries of foreign companies that are located in India. The likes of Amazon India, Goldman Sachs, JPM India. All of these were always thought to be, foreign source. Because the FCRA until 2016 said that subsidiaries of foreign companies in India, even though they are incorporated as Indian private companies or Indian public companies, will be considered a foreign. However, I think a little bit of an overlooked amendment that was brought in 2016 means that these wholly owned subsidiaries of foreign companies are no longer considered as foreign source, provided their foreign investment was made in accordance with the foreign exchange control regulations, which presumably all entities will be compliant with the foreign exchange control regulations. So this means that the CSR funds coming from all of these companies are actually not a foreign source, and they will not be considered as foreign contributions, and therefore that gives them the flexibility to fund entities which do not have an FCRA registration either. But this basically opens up a larger pool of what I would now term as domestic fund, which NGOs should look to tap into.
And again, I think the last question for our discussion today, Samheeta, is I think really given some of these emerging changes in the FCRA and what we discussed on the CSR, what are other ways for nonprofits to ensure that they continue to survive and sustain and create the fantastic impact that they're creating in the society today? Are there things that you would suggest from your purview?
Ever since these amendments have come in, that is a question that has been top of mind for a lot of people in terms of making, structural changes, governance changes live with these amendments. But the bottom line is that obviously subgranting ban is critical, but what is also game-changing amendment that has come in is the whole reduction of administrative expenses, because this essentially means that talent acquisition and retention in the nonprofit sector is going to be a great challenge. Presumably, foreign contributions that were coming in were allocated, to the maximum extent towards acquiring and retaining professionals to govern and manage these nonprofit organizations. And it kind of feels like a vicious circle that, the government says, oh, these NPOs are not well governed, and they go out and try to get professional talent to manage their entities, but you can't afford to pay them. So, I fall back into the trap of poor governance. So I think the bottom line now is that you need to identify other sources of funding or grants, looking towards domestic sources, and look at CSR funding. I think the second and probably untapped and overlooked market is retail giving. There has been a lot of focus in the last, I would say, maybe 4 to 5 years or maybe a little longer, where there is an active sense of retail philanthropy at an individual level. And the third piece, I think, is just crowdfunding, Keto, and a lot of these other platforms where people espouse their causes, generate a lot of money through retail giving. So I think these three sources are going to be critical.
And building on what you're saying, our own work at Sattva, we released a report called the Everyday Giving Report, which really looked at the retail giving market. And what we saw there was that in 2017, everyday givers, which is regular Indians, contributed 34,000 crores towards charitable causes overall. So there is a significant chunk of that contributions that people actually in India provide, and only 10% of that funding today goes to nonprofit organizations. And given some of the recent changes that we are seeing with respect to technology-based giving, Facebook and so on, getting into the giving space as well, what we actually see is that the channels of engaging everyday givers in India is actually growing, and the friction that is there to receive that money is also coming down, which means some of the overheads that are part of retail giving is actually starting to reduce. So in the current environment, I think finding an effective strategy for citizen engagement first as a nonprofit organization and being able to leverage that for retail giving, I think is going to be an extremely important conversation. Thank you so much for your insights. I think they're very practical, very relevant, and to the point. Thank you for listening to this month's episode on transforming nonprofits. We really enjoyed talking to Samheeta about the FCRA 2020 amendments and their potential impact on the nonprofit ecosystem. We especially liked the part on how nonprofit organizations can reorient their funding strategies by focusing more on domestic funding and retail funding. To know more about FCRA, you can read our article on India Development Review titled FAQs on FCRA Act 2020. And if you're interested in learning more about the retail funding ecosystem, you can read the Everyday Giving in India report published by Sattva. This is your host, Ratish Balakrishnan. Thank you and see you for the next episode.